Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan, and with me, my editor-in-chief, Nitin Gokhale. You're on our flagship weekly show, Talking Point, and we have with us the chief of ICRIER, the economic policy think tank, Rajat Kathuria, in the hot seat. And obviously, we're talking about the economy, India's and the world's. So, Rajat, first question, how bad is the economy? Is it the worst in living memory, worse even than 2008?
Hi, Surya. Hi, Nitin. Great to be
Hi.
on the show. Yes, I think in my living memory, for the last 50 years, I haven't seen an impact as large as this in such a short period of time. So this is indeed, in my living memory, both global and local. I think both as far as India is concerned. This is one of the biggest impact that I'm seeing. It may not be as long drawn out as we think it will be, but it's going to be substantial.
Right. When you say it may not be as long drawn out as we all think, what would be your prognosis going forward once the lockdown is lifted in India and situation stabilizes elsewhere in the world? How long do you think the immediate impact will last?
I think the immediate impact will depend on how soon the lockdown is lifted. As of now, we have a lockdown for about 3 weeks. If it remains at 3 weeks, it'll take about another week to 10 days for things to get rolling again, uh, for the supplies, for the supply chain to get re-energized and kick-started. So if it lasts for about a month in total, then there will be an impact. Of course, there will be an impact both on the fourth quarter and on the overall GDP for 2020. And we were expecting anywhere a GDP which would be around 5% or less than 5% growth. I think this could shave a few hundred basis points or in the neighborhood of a few hundred basis points of the GDP growth. But if it doesn't flatten, if the curve doesn't flatten out as we expect it to, then I think the impacts could be much larger. But the reason I'm saying that we could take care of this is that there has been a sort of response mechanism both on the fiscal policy as well on the monetary policy. But I think the fiscal policy is going to be much more effective in this case. So a response mechanism has been put into place to sort of cushion and buffer the shock. How much that will do, I think the numbers will tell us. But there is a quick response mechanism that has been put in place that gives us hope. If we had let it go without any response, then of course the impacts would have been much larger. And there have been some modeling exercises that have been done across the world to suggest that if nothing had been done, the impacts would have been much deeper and much more intense. So my comment has to be seen in the light of the fact that there has been a quick response mechanism that has been put in place. There have been expenditure switching policies. More importantly, there have been expenditure reducing policies that have been put in place. So I think that means that there will be a recovery. And I think this is also an opportunity to look at the nature of the recovery, the nature of our structural transformation. Obviously, we were in a situation where our economy was growing in a sort of unsustainable manner, and it was also highly unequal, which is to say that inclusion and sustainability were both sort of being compromised in our structural model of growth. And I think this is an opportunity to look at a new model so that sustainability and inclusion are mainstreamed rather than they become sort of co-benefits of the growth model. So I think they should be mainstreamed in our growth model.
Do you think some sectors will get impacted far more than some other sectors? And related to that, the supply chains globally, would that affect Indian productivity or Indian GDP? You mentioned some 100 basis points may be shaved off. I think the Economist, if I'm not mistaken, has spoken about the GDP going down to 2% in
Right.
India and 1% for China. And that they're saying India will still be the fastest growing economy. So, in that sense, which sectors do you think will get impacted the most?
I think there is the when this crisis started in China, the two sectors that everybody was talking about, one was pharmaceuticals and the other was automobiles, and related to that was also electronics, because this crisis began in China. And what happened because of our supply chains in automobiles and pharmaceuticals were linked with China. The initial disruption was thought to be in those sectors. But with the lockdown, I think it's going to affect all sectors. This is essentially a supply side shock, which is permeating into the demand side. So when you are shutting down factories, when you are shutting down restaurants, when you're shutting down airlines, this is pretty much a broad-based shock, both in the manufacturing industrial sector as well as in the services sector. Some essential services continue, electricity, gas, water supply, those continue. So therefore, to that extent, you won't see much impact there. But other sectors, services sectors, logistics, airlines, manufacturing, there's been a shutdown, and the extent and the intensity of the shock will depend on how quickly the shutdown is reflected. And there's a moral trade-off for India here, and I think that is. Nobody wants to be in a situation, that hot seat, to take that decision. There is really a moral trade-off. Do you sacrifice growth and save lives now, or do you, continue with your growth model and accept the kind of damages in terms of lives that you will have? So it's a trade-off between saving lives and saving livelihoods. And I think a lot of people in the past in India have been talking about, essentially how important it is to save livelihoods, because people's jobs have gone. We've seen intense migration back to the states where the migrant labor came from, and there's obviously no wage labor that is available there. So if they don't die of the disease, they'll probably die of starvation. And so therefore, I'm saying this is a good time to essentially look at a new structural model for ourselves. And what I mean by that, I've had conversations with Surya before about the UBI, the Universal Basic Income, and putting a good social security architecture in place. I think this is a good time to restart that conversation. It's extremely difficult to build a social security architecture while there is a crisis in place, just like it's very difficult to build a public health response architecture or a system while you have a public health emergency. You want to sort of do as much as you can with the existing infrastructure. But I think it's important for India to recognize that we need to look at a new model. We need to focus on education and health, improve our healthcare and public health facilities, look at a social security architecture. I'm not necessarily saying UBI or universal basic income, but a quasi-universal basic income mechanism where things have started. It's good that we have already in place a sort of direct benefit transfer architecture where the government can use to put money in people's bank account. It's never going to be enough. Even in Europe, where they're transferring about $1,200, it's not going to be enough. In India, where you're thinking of doing 2,000 rupees a month or 500 rupees, it's never going to be enough. But it's at least something. Because when you're addressing a calamity of this nature, you need to be able to provide for some sort of cash transfers to people so that at least they can get on with their basic needs.
That's right.
Rajat, is there any estimate of the kind of losses we've incurred during the period of the shutdown? How it has impacted? I mean, we've seen migrants going back, factories being shut down and all. But is there any rough estimate that has been reached as to the kind of losses we've incurred?
Well, I've seen some numbers in some sort of back of the envelope calculations that people have been making. But remember, this is really uncharted, not only uncharted for the globe, but it's also uncharted territory for India as well. Some estimates suggest that we would lose in terms of absolute numbers if the lockdown stays for 3 weeks and we kickstart back in about, let's say, a week. I've seen some numbers, absolute numbers, which are in the region of 9 lakh crores. And remember, our total fiscal or the budget of the government is about 21 lakh crores. So 9 lakh crores as a percentage of 21 lakh crores, that's the sort of order of magnitude that I've seen would be the impact of the lockdown. But these numbers are, I think, initial numbers. These are back of the envelope calculations. We don't really have a model in place right now that will be able to tell us the extent of the damage that will be caused to GDP. Because remember, if you're losing jobs and job losses are going to be sort of much quicker, although the government is trying to prevent bankruptcies from happening, the government is trying to prevent job losses, at least in the organized sector, from happening by giving some sort of subsidies to companies as well, so that they don't close down, or at least they continue to pay wages to their labor. But remember, those people on daily wages and the images, those distressing images that we've seen of people moving back to villages, now for them to sort of get back into where they were, or at least finding something new to do, those transactions costs are going to be very high. A good comparison, well, not a good comparison, but a comparison at least is the time in 2016 November, when we had demonetization, and we saw that the sort of adverse effects were felt on the unorganized and informal sector. And pretty much with this lockdown, what is happening is that you see the impact much more on the informal sector, on the unorganized sector, and trying to get jobs back in that sector because reverse migration has happened. Those costs are going to be very high because we are, as you know, there is a lot of asymmetric information. Where are the jobs? How is the demand and supply going to meet? Not talking about the skill mismatch, just the demand and supply. How is that mismatch going to be addressed? Because people need to have information of where the jobs are. Are they willing to make that trip back in a period of relative uncertainty? Because we don't know whether this is going to be a single peak, even if we flatten the curve, whether this is going to be a single peak or will it reoccur? Will there be a sort of a double peak later down the line? So these are uncertain questions. And I think, therefore, which is what I said in the beginning, that this is a good time for India to begin to look at sort of reinforcing and strengthening its public health system, its surveillance system, etc., and also have a good social security architecture in place so that these sort of disruptions can be cushioned as best as we can.
Right, Rajat. In fact, you've given a very nice broad picture of what's likely to happen and what has happened. In fact, one last point that I wanted to ask a question on, is you briefly mentioned it, of course, that the reversal of the reverse migration, if that doesn't happen, then does that impact the infrastructure economy and also the sort of revival of the economy in the infrastructure segment, especially where India is supposed to be doing a lot of new infrastructure projects, both in the urban sector as well as in the rural areas? Will that get impacted, and that in turn will affect the economy?
Yes, I mean, certainly in the short term, the infrastructure, I think the choice that the government has already made, and I think a sensible choice that the government has made, is that you sort of reduced expenditure, and you will reduce expenditure on infrastructure and divert it for social security or direct benefit transfers. There's no point building a road in a rural area when it's not going to be used. So divert that expenditure into paying cash to people so that their livelihoods can be saved. So I think that the first part of the impact, of the first part of the shock, of the government's response to the first shock, is to try and provide cash to people, and therefore defer the investments in infrastructure. Over time, I think the second and third phase of the recovery cycle will be to put in place sort of macroeconomic policies that encourage investment to happen, to revive the animal spirits in the economy. And then the third phase will be how to sustain that recovery. And I think that's the point I was making, is that if you're going to sustain this recovery, this might as well be a better recovery, or a more sustained and a more inclusive recovery. But it's important to kickstart the infrastructure. India has to build infrastructure, both logistics, the supply chain, and lots of weaknesses in the supply chain infrastructure have come to light even as we speak today as a result of this crisis. For example, the harvest season is going to happen now in the next 2 weeks or so. We'll have Baisakhi and there's going to be the harvest season. Many of the crops are ready for harvest. and crops that are being harvested now. There are anecdotal reports coming in that the mandis are closed. Where do you go to sell your produce that you're going to harvest? And I have to harvest and sell immediately because the warehousing facilities are almost non-existent in rural areas, and they're not very good. Even if they exist, the warehousing facilities are not good. So there'll be a lot of sort of harvesting and maybe distressed sales, but there'll be a problem reaching into the market. So this anecdote, maybe this is more than an anecdote. Probably this occurs in more areas than we imagine. So it's a good time to look at building rural infrastructure, strengthening the supply chains, especially for agricultural produce. Remember, in our growth model, or in our GDP, 50% of the people are still dependent on agriculture one way or the other, directly or indirectly. So agriculture is really backbone of the rural economy. So strengthening the sort of forward linkages in agriculture, which is where your infrastructure needs to be built. So the second phase, as I said, of the recovery cycle would be to kickstart the infrastructure cycle again, to kickstart the investment cycle. And for that, it's extremely important to have sensible macroeconomic policies in place, not only just interest rates, but somehow trying to revive the animal spirits in the economy so that demand gets revived in the economy, and people begin to invest in India. Again, very, stories before the shock actually happened, before the lockdown happened, a lot of people were not investing. Investment has gone to less than 30% of GDP from a peak of 36% of GDP. And a lot of investment that would have been due to India, both by Indians and by overseas investors, was happening outside of India, which is that Indians were investing outside, and investors that were exiting East Asia, exiting China, were reluctant to come to India and were going to other countries in Southeast Asia and even in South Asia, and not coming to India. So it's important for us, I think, to kickstart that investment cycle in India, so that Indian investment is also then incentivized to stay in India, and we are able to attract investment from overseas as well. And that will be the second phase of the recovery cycle, which is prudent macroeconomic policies that need to be put in place to kickstart innovation. At this time, when we are doing a sort of immediate response to the crisis and to the lockdown, I think we should not worry too much about prudential norms and fiscal deficit. We should just try to save as many lives and save as much of livelihoods as possible, because this is important. There's no point trying to bolt the door when the horse is bolted. So we have to sort of do this now, and then worry about the macroeconomic policies and the structural transformation a little later.
Great. In fact, so clearly it's a long haul, as we can see, and the economy will take its time to revive. As you rightly said, and I think you answered that question very well, that the government should not worry too much about the fiscal deficit, but look at the immediate saving of lives and livelihood. That actually sums up the whole discussion. I think, Rajat, thank you very much, as usual. Very articulate and very lucid explanation of where we are. You are on talking point, and don't forget to those who are viewing this, don't forget to like us on various social media platforms that we have, and keep sending the feedback. But thank you very much, Rajat, for joining this conversation.
Thank you, Nitin. Thank you, Surya. As always, a pleasure.